Hello, brother. How are you? I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share with you and connect with you again. I actually saw your billboard about the show The Village on the West Side Highway, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. But it also reminded me that I said I would get back to you with um, my theory of the gangsters versus the gods. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I know your time is short, so I'm going to try to get this into a concise package, as a concise package as I possibly can. So let me give you a little bit about my background really quickly. Um, After college, I became a Christian, religious, and I was very religious for a while. And during those years, I took to studying the Bible very extensively. And as a matter of fact, the church organization that I was a part of, it was actually a part of our daily life to read the Bible every day. And oftentimes, I read it for an hour or more. And I was surrounded by people who lived the same way. So we often would share with each other new insights, new information, new ways of going deeper into the scriptures and dissecting different aspects of the scriptures. So that was my life for a while. And then, my church was, I guess, how could I say, it fell apart. It fell apart because of a financial scandal. And it just seems like, any church I was ever a part of, it always seemed to be something scandalous, usually related to sex or money. Go figure, right? So why should this church be any different? And I just, came to the conclusion that, God can't be in this to me. If God is all these attributes of good and truthfulness and purity, it just never seemed to be present in that environment, and I questioned it a great deal. And so that led me to other things, and then I had this like major aha moment in which it literally woke me up out of my sleep, and it was like, oh my gosh, all of this is in your mind. And when I realized that, I then was compelled to look deeper into other teachings and kind of start going into esoteric teachings and metaphysics and Buddhism. Buddhism, um, I always say, is something that saved my life because it helped me to understand my personal responsibility in my life, and that I am the creator of my experience, and that the power is within me. And after living in fear and embracing the doctrine that's riddled with fear, um, it was difficult at first to grasp this fearlessness way of being. And it still, it took me quite a bit of time to work the fear out. And I'm always working out different fears because I was so, inundated with that way of teaching or that doctrine that it was difficult to let go of the fear. And I just find that I'm always coming up against a new fear to face and overcome. And that is the key, but that's also the, I guess, the root of what I realized is the gods versus the gangsters. And I'm going to try to explain that as much as I can. Um, so I made a few notes here. And so let's see here. I guess after, delving into some of the esoteric teachings, I then started taking courses. I wanted to start a business. And so I started taking some courses at Not For Profit in Harlem, and realized that some of the terminology that I was seeing in some of the business journals and some of the works that we were doing, like the terminology was different, but it was very similar to some of the esoteric teachings that I was studying. And I began to make a connection between this thing between spirit and business. And I don't know how to put it any other way. So anyway, with that said, I made the connection between the two. Um, then I, started listening to a lot of different spiritual teachers, and just to develop more of an understanding. And with that said, I began to, connect the dots. I think it was, I think I heard Steve Jobs say that one time, like connect the dots and read between the lines. I actually think I heard Malcolm X say that before. It's like, nothing, take nothing at face value. Nothing is as it appears to be. So with that said, that's what I started to do. And one day, I was working in this boutique real estate office, and um, the owner of the office, he had some friends that were in the construction business. They would often stop by and just discuss different things. And I would always hear them talk about the Godfather. It was always this thing with the Godfather, but you always hear men talk about the Godfather. So I said, well, what? Let me, go watch this movie and just see, what the hype is about The Godfather. And I sat down and I watched the movie part one and part two. I didn't get a chance to watch part three, even though I went online. I couldn't find part three, but I went online and just, read a synopsis and different things about part three. To me, part three is a very important part, but that seems to be the part nobody likes. But it's very important, dynamic, because that's a very spiritual aspect of the whole experience, and people just kind of dismissed it. With that said, I watched the movie, and based on the conversations that with the brothers, I felt they missed the whole thing. They missed the whole point to the film, or the story, if you will. And to me, it was a story of a legacy. It was a story of a man who became a part of something, and the whole thing was to keep it going. And so you have to have a legacy. And as you know, he didn't want his son to become a part of that whole thing. And he didn't really have, um, but that son was the only son that could really carry out the responsibility of the whole thing. But to me, I saw a story of a family man. There were a lot of different dynamics other than him just being a gangster and getting what he wants based on imposing fear, and the whole thing of business. I mean, he was a man of also integrity, in how he did things per se. And if you remember the beginning of the movie, he was actually a little dismayed by the whole thing of a gangster and how a gangster would intimidate his own people and things like your own people, things like that. So I took that into account, and when I go out into the world, being a driver in New York, I encounter a lot of people. And so I met this guy. He works in this little like dive place. And so sometimes I'll stop by the dive, just to get a quick drink and use the restroom. And then we end up working out a deal that he would give me a meal and I would give him a ride home sometimes. And so we develop a rapport. And this guy, he's happens to be black. He's with a Caribbean background, and he grew up Buddhist, which is odd. Not many black people in the Western Hemisphere that I know of grow up Buddhist. And so around, he said, I guess his late teens, early 20s, he was saying that was his first encounter with the Bible. So he really didn't grow up in this mindset of Christianity and salvation and something's coming to save you, and he just wasn't familiar with that. And so when he did finally read the Bible, he was saying that his first impression was like, this, no God would write anything like this, imposing fear on people, and thou should have no other God before me. I'm so jealous. And so he said, and it was really quite comical at the time, he said, no God would write this. This is a dude. Only a dude thinks like this. And I was like, hmm. And so I was like, interesting. And so that just gave me more insight and more of a confirmation of a speculation I had. And I began to be really observant. As a driver in New York, which is interesting enough, you become an observer of a lot of things. You have to watch how things flow, and just how people flow around the city. And one of the first things I observe is this, um, this orbit of sorts. People move in this fashion around really, um, believe it or not, how can I say this? People move around money and those that control the money. I'll say that for now. And it was really interesting to watch that. And so this almost like the people who create the money, own the money, manufacture the money, they are the center, and people move around that. And the more I began to observe that, is how I began to realize this thing that I call the gangsters versus the gods. And it's really interesting because when you take in consideration the Bible, which is where we're introduced to this concept that we know as God, it teaches you to fear God. And a lot of times people adopt that as some sort of noble endeavor. Fear God. I'm a God fearing person. And to me, if anything, that's God should never be feared. It's all about love. And when you take that into consideration, fear is very paralyzing, even as it would pertain to wanting to know or get to a higher place of understanding about this concept or this deity that we've personified as God. Um, and so fear is always is a ego, is egocentric, and so the ego feeds on fear. So with that said, I just realized that the Old Testament is really more about fear, whereas the New Testament is supposed to be more about being saved, so to speak, and through this Christ character. And, he brings salvation. And so there's this element of love, even though it's still supported by fear, which is not really authentic. Um, I would say, in a biblical sense, and it's really interesting because, like, the Old Testament is sort of gangster because in the Old Testament, um, the God presence, or what we've personified as Father God, has given commands of war in many cases. In some cases, there was even it was kill the women and the children in certain cases. So it's a very violent nature, to this God in the Old Testament, and we know that the New Testament brings a new covenant. So how that ties in, I'll keep going. Um, the gangster, the pimp, the slave master, they're all archetypes of the same thing. They all exploit, and they all usually exploit to people at a disadvantage. And if you really think about it, it's symbolic, symbolic of what I would call the devil character that we know of. These are archetypes of that. And so I would actually, even venture, if you really take a minute to think about it, that it's sort of cowardly. It's cowardly to exploit people who are weaker or at a disadvantage. Um, I have a tendency to make anything my teacher. I said the universe will have a tendency to align you when it wants you to learn something, especially if you've already put the questions out to the universe. You're going to, the universe is going to guide you. It's going to align you. I mean, the universe speaks in emotion and vibration and frequency. So it doesn't necessarily always speak in language, but it will use something to speak to you. I mean, I've learned a profound lesson from a baby. So I always look around because any given moment, any given thing, or any given person could be a teacher. It could come from a song, a commercial, a billboard. Like I saw your billboard that said, it was a big heart recently. So it could be anything at any given time. So I remember watching the movie A Bronx Tale and getting a profound, I guess, insight about the gangster character. I remember in A Bronx Tale, it was his father versus the gangster, and he was looking to which man he wanted to become. And it was easy to be impressed with the gangster. Everybody seems to be around the gangster, loving the gangster, looking up to him and respecting him by appearances. And there was a conversation he had between him and the gangster, and he asked the gangster, is it better to be loved or feared? And the gangster said it is better to be feared. And, again, fear is very integral in this dynamic between gods versus the gangsters. Um, in the Old Testament, as I said before, it's all about fearing God. Um, in our life journey, it's the Bible's really about our journey. It's really about ourselves, respectively, and how we journey from fear to love. And love is the goal. And love is a vibration. It's the highest vibration. It's the most powerful creative force that is available not just on the earth but in the universe and in the galaxies. It's like oftentimes um, when we think of God, we put God in a box, in His Bible, just as one little book. Those of us who subscribe to Western teachings, it's important to know the difference within yourself, the difference between fear and love, and where you're operating from. That's also going to determine how you make choices in life. That's something that I personally learned. And if ever you're at those crossroads, it's always like um, learning yourself so you'll always choose love and not act out of fear. If you act out of fear, you're going to ultimately guide yourself to a place that's hell like, a place of despair, poverty, lack, all types of discord and dissipations, depression, illness. It's like you end up leading yourself in that direction because all your choices in your, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're being guided by your fears, and you will come face to face with your fears. I've actually seen that in my own personal journey. And there's a gestation period, so everything is imprinted on the spiritual realm through how you feel, through fear or love. And the spiritual realm is not prejudice, it's not bias, it's whatever you implant in it. It is very impartial. It's going to show up in our experience as a tangible reality. So, with that said, you must truly know yourself, in order to know the distinction between fear and love and where you're operating from. And it's important in the dynamic of the God versus the gangster, because the gangster seeks to impose fear and basically take advantage of a person who doesn't love themselves. And whereas love seeks to add value to anyone, even to the gangster, because you're adding value. You're it's all love. And so even though a gangster by appearances is an undesirable or a bad person, or a person that imposes harm, um, we all need love. There's love in everything in different measures and degrees. It's just that in that environment that this person has created, the degree of love is small because of the amount of fear that's there. So as I continue, I have my notes here. So um, we spoke that day about we're living in a game. As you know, I said one of the other important aspects of the movie, which many people don't pay attention to, is the logo. And the Godfather is the invisible hand, it's the puppeteer. And so with that said, it's like there is an agenda. In the movie, you saw how they were able to make a lie a certain type of reality. So a lot of times in rap music, in the culture, if you will, I hate to say it's culture because it's more corporate now. It's like rap music is not what it was or what it was intended to be when it was created by the people. It was more of a music that spoke of, in spite of, like, our environment and our lack of opportunity tangibly in a material sense. There was an element of fun and love and rising above your circumstances. Then it just became this other thing, gangster rap, the thug. And so all of a sudden that began to be the thing to be, because there's this impression that's how you're going to get what you want. So um, media tends to, the society we live in tends to, through the media, often, it often downplays a person that is loving and kind as being weak, and it upplays and gives a lot of credence to the gangster, the person who's violent and destructive, as being strong and bad and fierce. And so they celebrate the gangster and they don't celebrate the other aspect, which is love. Yet we say we believe in it. When you watch the behavior, and people tend to seem to be very unconscious of it, they really are celebrating money. And it's really important because the powers, quote unquote, that be, they basically use religion to impose this fear, this like massive fear. It's like a virus. And what that does, and then they put on the money and God we trust. So it's a mind trick. It's a mind trick. It causes you to think in the reverse, in the reverse way of what is a godly mind, a mind of expansion. So it basically puts you in reverse. So with that said, let's keep going. So society itself is a reflection. Society is a reflection of the imprints that are imposed in the spiritual realm. So if you either plant an idea or a concept into the spiritual realm, through your emotions and your thoughts. So a thought plus an emotion is how something is planted into the spiritual realm. Think of the spiritual realm as a massive, fertile field, an open, fertile field where you can plant anything, and it's impartial. You can plant something beautiful, or you can plant something not so beautiful. A beautiful flower, a weed. Both will grow, and they both have a germination time. So things don't just show up in your environment just because you thought a thought today. There's a process. There's a time before it shows up in the environment, but it must show up. It's universal spiritual law. That's the way it works. Now, the people who created the Bible and the concept of God that we all subscribe to, they knew this. They knew when they taught us fear. They knew this. And that's what makes this whole thing, and the people who created it, very dangerous, because they know how to manipulate the minds of the people to create an atmosphere or a reality. And people are saying things like, keep it real, keep it real. And it's so foolish, because you don't keep it real, you make it real. If you're keeping it real, now you do want to be authentic. Maybe it should be keep it authentic, but it doesn't have a nice ring to it, does it? But authenticity is what is really the desire. And I think when somebody says keep it real, it's more about, what it means to be authentic, perhaps, rather than keep it real. Because when you're keeping it real, basically what you're doing is like you're basically keeping yourself in a tangible reality you don't desire. So you're saying you're poor, you're downtrodden, and that's not what you want to be. But by exclaiming that over and over again, you're basically reinforcing, because they say, like, that's what you resist, persist. It's all about what you focus on. And so let me keep going. Back to the God versus gangster. Okay, let me go a little bit into the God. As we know, God, the attributes of God that we are all familiar with, and you don't have to be religious to know it, because it's kind of in our environment. Most of us do grow up with some type of church upbringing or some type of religion, whether it's Muslim. But most of us in the Western, those are the Western religions, the Judaism, um, Islam, and Christianity, or what they call the big threes in the West. So those are Western teachings, and they're all really fear-based. And even when I went to read um, the Quran reads a lot like the Bible, but there's also a lot of fear there. Now, if I choose to read the Bible for inspiration or anything, it's, the foundation of my spiritual journey, so I won't just throw it away. There are certain things I appreciate. I do get some value from the Bible, but I do not like to utter the phrase fear God, because that's really calling down a great curse upon yourself. I'd rather speak the phrase love God. And that gives me power. Even as I say it now, I feel something move in my soul, in my spirit. I just feel something when I say love God. And that expands you, expands your God consciousness, your God spirit, your godliness. But when you say fear God, it makes the spirit within you shrink. And that's the whole objective. That's been the agenda all along. And that way they can control what is within you through fear versus you controlling it and expanding it and becoming a God yourself. That's like when I sent you those scriptures. I sent those scriptures to you for a reason so that you could see it even in this text, these teachings, it's there. In the book of John is spoken by Jesus himself. And the book of John chapter 10, I sent you that scripture. As I said before, it's all a mind trick. And they want us to think backwards is what it really is. The elusive they, it's often people say they who, the elusive they. Um, as I continued my, studies, um, I realized that what I was learning and discovering to be God was completely the opposite of this fear monger. The true God is very gentle, very loving, and those attributes are actually described in the New Testament very beautifully, and to me actually very perfectly, in First Corinthians, when it's a very famous, people use this passage a lot at funerals and weddings. Love is kind, love is patient, is not easily angered, it holds no records of wrongs. It's very different describing that as God than this, thou shalt have no other God before me. I am a jealous God. And even if you take, in consideration the definition of jealousy, it's not an attractive feature. It's a useless emotion. Jealousy is a completely useless emotion. It does no good to anyone who is jealous. Um, I really value this time of year the most because it's spring, and coming into contact with this understanding of what I know now, of what I learned through Buddhism, is this life force, this power, this energy that makes things grow, is also, it lives within us. And it's, to me, in the spring, it becomes so evident and clear. This life force is present. It's the thing, or it's what gives life. It's what make, how did I say it before? It's what make living possible. It's life itself. And you see it, as the trees start to bud, the flowers come out on the end of the trees, then they become these beautiful green leaves. I mean, it's really amazing. And even as I'm envisioning the blossoms on the trees, it brings so much joy in the springtime. And it's just such a very concise evidence of what God really is. God is that power, that force of energy that pushes those blades of grass through the ground this time of year. As the spring comes, you see the flowers blooming and the trees blooming. That is the power that is God itself. And oftentimes, from a Western aspect, they see nature as something God created. In the East, there is no specific personification of the power in the way they do in the West, and as they call it, Father God and things of that nature. But it's just more about the power itself. And I guess I would call it the power of life and what makes life live. That's how I put it. It's what makes life alive. And that is what I would call God. In Buddhism, there's a term known as kukachu. is, and the Beatles did a song, Cuckoo Cuckoo, years ago, but that's what it is, Cuckoo Cuckoo. Um, I want to stay on course. Okay, so I read this book called The Science of Getting Rich, and that's where I first began to see the distinctions um, between God versus the gangster, because they don't use that terminology specifically in the book, but they talk about the two aspects. They allude to it, the two aspects to wealth, the two roads to wealth. And one pulls from, or is a competitive road, which is the road that the gangster often takes, because the gangster is coming from a place of fear and lack. And then there's a creative road, which is the godly aspect, where you add value to the lives around you and you get money or energy in return for that. And the gangster is about taking. And it's really interesting, and something that when I see, rap culture embrace this, it's really sad, because we went from being a people that were more God oriented, even though the God aspect may not have been concisely accurate. It was sincere. It was a sincere celebration of God. And so, what probably, if we had stayed on that path of our ancestors, that in spite of slavery, in spite of Jim Crow and segregation and all the injustices that we had survived in this country, and in this story that we know as his story, all the ways that we've prevailed, if we had stayed on that path, it would have only been a matter of time before we would have truly been, I guess, come face to face and been able to encounter the truth. And that would have come about because of the sincerity of celebrating God. Whether it was right or wrong, what was is that it was sincere. Black people are sincere when they celebrate God. It may not be the true God, but the heart behind it is genuine. And the universe would reward that because there's love there. And so we would, even when I first realized that what I was celebrating, um, it wasn't the true God. I mean, at first I was devastated. And yeah, it took a lot. It took a lot. I was like, whoa. And well, I take that back. At first, I celebrated because I was happy to be free. But then as time went on, I really thought about it. I was like, wow, man, I really believed this stuff. I really believed it. I mean, I was basing my life on it and what I wanted to do with my life. And so many people do that. But it's actually because it's a fear-based teaching, it is fertile ground for corruption. And it's one of the primary reasons why you're seeing all that you're seeing in our society right now. This religion is the prerequisite to all of that. And it fuels fear. So let me keep going. So you have the competitive versus the creative, and the competitive road is the gangster's road, all about competition, not having enough. I gotta have more than you. Versus the creative, there are consequences to that. When you get on that competitive road and you do things that are against the universe, on that road, on the gangster's road, if you will, if I'm nickname it that for now till I can think of something better. Say you kill, and if you kill, you're going to have to suffer the consequences as with karma. Karma is inevitable for everybody. You may not face it in this life, but you will face it. It is inevitable. You cannot, under any circumstances, escape karma. Nobody can. Karma, we all have to face it. If you impose harm in any way, you have to suffer the consequences of that, even if you impose harm to yourself, which many of us do by suppressing our greatness, by denying ourselves. That was something that a teaching that I had embraced through the Christian church I was a part of. And there's consequences to that. There's consequences to depression. Um, there's even karma for not loving yourself. So it's really would behoove us to really understand the power of this love. But you know we create this world. One thing you'll say, it's not boring. It's never boring. As we move on, the goal is to become a creator. And again, like I said, that's why I sent you the scripture that even Jesus, says, "Don't you know that ye are all gods?" And so the ultimate is to, shed the skin of fear and recognize that your true nature is love. And you do that through the transformation. And it goes deeper into understanding the true teachings of the story that we know as Christ. I'm trying to choose my words carefully because I know, again, we don't have a lot of time, and I know I have a tendency to go off on tangents. So I'm trying to keep myself here. Forgive me. And that I'll go into, have if we ever have another chance to build, but I want to stay on this right now. And so when you recognize yourself as a God, then you also recognize your power, your personal power. They say, I like to say knowledge is power, but to have knowledge of self is to be empowered. And even in First Corinthians, it says, where there is knowledge, it will one day pass away. But of all things, the only thing that will always remain is love. And what I also value about that passage is that it says love will never fail. And that's a promise from the universe that love will never fail. And so learning to love yourself first is the most important part, because as you learn to love yourself, you won't fail yourself. You'll begin to develop a constitution that can withstand just about anything. Even in, Jesus used to often say that, behold, I send you a sheep among wolves. So in essence, when you are aspiring to be a loving person, you're like a sheep, you're gentle, because the true nature of God is gentle. But you're going out into a world of wolves. So you literally have to put on your wolf costume. In other words, it's almost like you got to put on the gangster costume, but really be a god, if I can say that. With, um, what I have a authentic concern for when it comes to our people, and this is where I really valued the conversation we had. I just could feel your passion for what's going on in Chicago. And this is all the more reason why I wanted to bring this, because if you're influencing brothers, I have a passion for our people, and I have a special love for men. Um, I've grown to value men in a way that I didn't learn growing up, because, I come from a single parent household. So my father wasn't there. I didn't grow up around a lot of men. Even though my mom's brother, my uncle, um, we rented from him, but I didn't have a relationship with him. As not in terms of like a mentor type relationship. But the black community, when I was growing up, I guess is both BC, black community BC, before crack, we had values. And the mark of a fine family wasn't based on money. It was based more on the values, your integrity, your dignity, your self respect. And that was the mark of a fine family. And one of the most important aspects of our community was home training. And I say that because where you see where we are now, we just threw the baby out with the bathwater. We just let go of our values. And we don't understand the significance of a value, because a value, what we're doing now, we're operating in the gangster mode, in because rap music is perpetuating that. Rap music is being used to market to the people that this is what you want to be, this is how you're going to get what you want in life. And it's a lie. It's a lie. They're basically trying to tell you that based on your worth, you will have value. And that's reverse. It's really the other way around. You can't determine your worth until you know your value. And values come from God alone. It's important to make that distinction. Very, very important. That, values, your worth should be based on your values. So, as I try to wrap up, I hope I did this justice. Sometimes I don't always have the ability to articulate my mind, the way my mind works. And it's like I said, I'm a firm believer that if black people had stayed on the path that their ancestors had carved for them, we would be in a very different place. Um, the truth would have ultimately been unveiled. It would have been, we would have seen the real power instead of the supposed power. Um, I do believe there is an agenda to suppress the knowledge, to suppress the truth that would prevent people from knowing their own power. If everybody knew their own power, there'd be no need for a government. And because nature or God would be the government. Just like in nature, you see a lion, a tiger, a bear, a tree, a fish. You see these animals behave according to nature, and they are obedient. I mean, we're so dumbed down that we have literally forgotten the magnificence of all creation, even ourselves. I mean, if you take a moment just to look at your hands and wiggle your toes, I mean, that's miraculous. Like, wow. And that's power. Yet they tell you money is power. Only things that have intelligence and operate without the help of some man made assistance is true power. What they tell us is power is actually control. And so, for instance, when you have a river, a powerful river, and they put a dam, the river is the power, the dam is the control. So, what we've learned to call power is the dam, is the block of power. And I guess in and of itself, you could say it has power, but we're giving more credence to the dam than we are the river. And money is actually the river. That's why they call it currency. And that's why they call the institutions that house our money banks, river banks. So that's another lesson for another day. So let's get back, and we're going to wrap this up. The gangster versus the God. The reason why the fear was implemented is to turn humankind into parasites. They become perpetual consumers because they are always operating from a place of fear and lack. And it's very dangerous because we're actually feeding on the planet without replenishing it. And they have us convinced that something's coming to save us when actually we're all here to save it. Like the movie The Matrix, Neo, we're all Neo. Anybody can be Neo, but anybody could be an agent. Too. I mean, with these cell phones, we all become agents. In the drop of a hat, somebody's filming somebody, all for this all-seeing eye, which is actually, as the TV show Big Brother watching. So we give Big Brother the power of the all-seeing eye. The all-seeing eye is something that is indwelling within all of us, but it's there seeking to control it. And that's the third eye. I'm pretty sure you've heard people talk about the third eye. Some people call it the first eye. So I personally, since learning this, I don't like to even address the deity as God, because it's such the opposite of everything I learned God to be. And once I realized that one day, I was like, well, if the characteristics of this God is such the opposite of what I learned, then what is what I learned? What was I really worshiping? What was I really turning to? And that is the big question. And when you really think about it, it's like, well, because the characteristics of this God, jealous, condemning, it's interesting how what we call Satan, which only means adversary, but let's just, for the sake of this conversation, let's just say Satan and the devil are the same. So what we call Satan actually has very same characteristics. Satan is a judge. I think part of the definition of word Satan is judge or because in other attributes of like how we characterize this character that we call Satan. And so I was like, no way. Could they have done this? Like, could they have really packaged this in such a way that we actually unconsciously, in our lack of understanding, awareness, and and consciousness and knowledge, are not really worshiping God at all, and we're just worshiping a concept that has no power. And the Bible actually itself, it warns us to not celebrate a God with no power, or a concept of God with no power, or doctrine, and also encourages you to watch your doctrine. So I'm going to sum this up. I don't even know how long I've been talking. I apologize if I've gone too far. As I said, when the government is using the media and marketing to perpetuate a gangster mentality in the population, and now everybody wants to be a boss, and all those things. And even when it comes to like sports, nobody wants to be the so-called so-and-so angels, or it's always like the so-so devils, or hell raisers, and all of these things, like you celebrate the devil, or what is called the devil. Again, to me, all of this is symbolic and allegorical, because the darkness, it does have its place in the universe. It's just that it's not supposed to be the overseer or the Lord. And that's another thing that I would elaborate on. Just the use of certain words in the Bible. I realized that they were how can I say it, misused, maybe is the word. I'm not sure how to term it, but there's certain words that are used, I guess misused is a good way of saying it. And Lord is one of those words. But again, that's another lesson for another day. So as I wrap this up, in essence, it's really fear versus love. I mean, I don't know if you can see this. I don't know. Let me see if I can show it to you. So I did a little diagram here that gives a little bit of insight of the theory. There's more to it, but this is just keep it in a simple form. You have the Godfather, you have Father God. The question is, are they the same? Underneath the Godfather is the gangster, it's the fear, it's the ego, it's the overseer or the Lord that lords over. Exodus 20 is the scripture that says, I am a jealous God. That's also the attitude of the gangster. There's also the beast, that comes up at another point. You've heard of the mark of the beast. And then you have Father God, which is what we've learned to call the deity, and which is love. And love is to the soul what fear is to the ego. And then you have the law, which is like the law of attraction. It's the laws of the universe that make the universe function. You have the attributes of love, which you're told in First Corinthians. And then there's the teaching that God is love itself. And God is really a guide. It's to guide you to your greatness. So with that said, I hope that clears up. I hope I got it out as concisely as I understand it. Sometimes, like I said, I understand things or I have it in my head, but I always, this is an attempt to articulate the things that are in my head. I will expound upon this. If you want to ask any questions, just let me know. And yeah, that's it. I think that's it. At the end of the day, love is all there is. And there's an agenda to get people to stop loving and to stop making love. And that's why you're seeing the world is in the condition. There are clues all around us. Even in that TV show, The Empire, I only watched the first season. I wasn't too impressed with it after the first season. I'm not an avid television watcher. Sometimes I just watch things out of curiosity. I haven't been an avid television watcher for many years, probably close to about 20, maybe even more than 20 years. I watch a little TV here and there, but anyway, in the TV show The Empire, um, Ron, what was his name? Um, Terrence Howard. I'm going to say Ron Howard. That's from Happy Days. Terrence Howard's character is called Lucius, which is a play on the name Lucifer. That's a clue. That's a major clue. Um, and most people seem to have missed it. It was very clear. But that's a clue in this whole, gangster thing. It's really about choices, even in the TV show Power, which I haven't even, couldn't even get past like an episode of Power because it's just so violent. I was like, ooh, this is a violent show. And it's graphic. It's one thing to kind of leave something to the imagination, but they leave like nothing to the imagination. And I didn't get deep into Power. Someone was just sharing with me recently how there's an aspect or element of the show in which he's trying to get out, but there's consequences. So at the end of the day, it's really about choices and knowing yourself and where you're operating from. These people who control, through the banks and politics and media, that create this paradigm, this society that we're living in, a game, the invisible hand, the people that control that, they don't want us to know the truth. If we did, they would lose power. I do believe there's a solution to all of this, of what could be done and how it could be done. I do. I think it can be done. I think that Black people can save themselves if they're willing to know the truth. But that remains to be seen at this juncture. So I thank you. I hope I answered the question. If I think of anything else, I'll make another quick video. I apologize if this one went a little long, if I went off on a tangent. I was trying to stay on, stay on course. So much love to you, much success, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Take care.